Author Edith Wharton described horror stories as the fun of the shudder. Virginia Woolf celebrated the ability of horror stories to satisfy the strange human craving for the pleasure of feeling afraid. Dashiell Hammett characterized them as the process of transporting readers from cannot happen to should not happen. And Peter Straub has linked our fascination with spooky stories to a primal distrust of nature, and to the loss of free will, agency, or self that the natural world fails to uphold. As I discussed in my previous video, horror short fiction has a long and illustrious history spanning more than 250 years. Short story anthologies published over the past century have traced the evolution and ever-changing boundaries of tasteful horror, and the cyclical competition it spawned between respectable literary stories intended to scare readers and sensationalized, pulpy tales that shock them. There are hundreds of horror short story anthologies. Most of them are well worth reading. In this video, I'll focus on the ones I think are among the best and most essential for readers who want broad exposure to the variety and history the genre has to offer. I've organized the anthologies into categories. There are historically significant ones that have influenced the horror genre's development and popular appeal. There are some that provide broad surveys of the genre's history, from its earliest examples to the modern era of today. I'll also highlight anthologies that focus on older, vintage works, as well as some that feature only newer works from recent decades. And I'll throw in a few noteworthy themed anthologies. The ones I've selected aren't necessarily my personal favorites, although I do think highly of them. Instead, I've based my choices on several criteria, including a desire to minimize overlap among the anthologies. Some redundancy is inevitable due to the historical importance of some stories and authors, leading them to be anthologized frequently. I've tried to limit duplication of stories among the volumes I've selected. I've also prioritized anthologies that, as a group, provide a diverse mix of story themes and styles, and that showcase different dimensions of the genre. Using the taxonomy I discussed in my previous video, it's an assortment of dry and wet, of internal terrors and external, and of natural threats and supernatural ones. And I've tried to prioritize anthologies that are reasonably obtainable. Horror anthologies typically don't remain in print for long. There are a few exceptions, but most have relatively short shelf lives, which complicates efforts to find copies of them in libraries and bookstores. Many of the ones I've selected can be purchased with relative ease on the used book market. However, a few are quite scarce and should be treasured if found. You should also be aware that some anthologies were published in multiple formats. Some were produced as a single omnibus book, and were also published broken up into several smaller volumes. In other cases, paperback reprints of some hardcover anthologies were abridged to include only a subset of the stories in the original edition. I'll try to note those instances as I go along. I've selected around 20 essential anthologies across the 5 categories I just described. I'll also highlight several honorable mentions that came close but didn't quite make the cut. Complete lists of the stories contained in each anthology can be found at the Internet Speculative Fiction Database at isfdb.org. In this first category, I've chosen 3 anthologies that played significant roles in popularizing the horror genre or in elevating its literary standing with mainstream readers. Going in publication order, the first is one I should have mentioned in my previous video. It's The Supernatural Omnibus, edited by Montague Summers and first published in 1931. It contains 36 stories written between 1831 and 1930, including a wide range of 19th century authors such as Richard Barham, Frederick Marryat, Charles Dickens, Oscar Wilde, and Sheridan Le Fanu. Summers was an eccentric, a self-styled Catholic cleric and witch hunter who became a recognized figure in the 1920s and 30s for his public investigations into the supernatural. He was a true believer in witchcraft, Satanism, and demonology, and his speculative research influenced a generation of horror writers and filmmakers. His notoriety gave this anthology wide distribution, and it's still in print today. The second historically significant anthology is probably the most widely read one of all time. It's Great Tales of Terror and the Supernatural, first published in 1944 and edited by Herbert Wise and Phyllis Fraser. More than 80 years later, it's still in print, and for good reason. It has 52 stories written between 1842 and 1941 that are organized into two sections, Tales of Terror and Tales of the Supernatural. Noteworthy authors include Honoré de Balzac, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, Guy de Maupassant, Edith Wharton, and Ernest Hemingway, just to name a few. As you might guess from the author lineup, most of the stories tend toward the drier and more literary side of the genre. Then there's Dark Forces, an anthology of 23 all-new works edited by Kirby McCauley. It appeared in 1980 as the horror genre was in the early stages of a modern renaissance, propelled by the novels of Stephen King, Peter Straub, and John Saul, among others. Dark Forces, alongside Ramsey Campbell's New Terrors anthology that same year, drew popular attention to modern works of short fiction in the genre, rejuvenating interest in the format and sparking an avalanche of horror anthologies, many of them excellent, over the next decade and a half. While Campbell's anthology is very good, I'm giving the nod to Macaulay's volume for inclusion in my list of essentials due to its solid slate of stories, which includes the first appearance of Stephen King's novella, The Mist, as well as works from Isaac Bashevis Singer, Joyce Carol Oates, Gene Wolfe, Lisa Tuttle, Joe Haldeman, Robert Aikman, Robert Bloch, and Gahan Wilson, among others. My honorable mentions are vintage anthologies from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that helped shape and rehabilitate the public's perception of the horror genre at a time when it was widely viewed as little more than pulpy sensationalism. Most of these are quite scarce in good condition, so if you run across one, you should grab it. There are the three hefty omnibus of crime anthologies that mystery writer Dorothy L. Sayers edited in 1929, 1932, and 1935, in which half the stories in them are tales of supernatural or psychological horror. Fellow mystery author Dashiell Hammett followed with his own anthology of thrillers and chillers in 1931, titled Creeps by Night, an anthology of modern horror stories, which contains 20 stories written between 1922 and 1931 by authors such as Stephen Vincent Benet, John Collier, and Conrad Aiken. And Arkham House publisher August Derleth edited a series of horror anthologies beginning with 1944's Sleep No More that sought to bring greater respectability to authors such as H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Frank Belknap Long, and others who were best known at the time to readers of pulp magazines such as Weird Tales. The modern horror renaissance that flourished in the 1970s and 80s fueled renewed interest in the genre's early roots and historical development, which led to a steady stream of retrospective anthologies that are cornucopias of some of the best horror stories ever written. There are many great anthologies that fit within this category, and you can't go wrong with any of the ones I'm including here. The dividing line between those I've deemed essential and those that are merely honorable mentions is a very thin one. If you want to prioritize your reading of horror anthologies, this category is where I suggest starting. Going chronologically, I'll begin with Leonard Woolf's 1979 anthology, Woolf's Complete Book of Terror. This might be the most eclectic of these broad survey anthologies, and it's also one of the very best. It contains 63 stories and a dozen classic poems, arranged roughly in reverse chronological order, from the most recent, 1973's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin, all the way back to ancient Greece and an excerpt about a vampire from Apuleius's The Golden Ass. Among the many highlights of this volume are Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, Richard Matheson's Born of Man and Woman, Jerome Bixby's It's a Good Life, George Langland's The Fly, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, and it even has excerpts from Jerzy Kosinski's disturbing 1968 novel Steps, The Black Mass of Joris Karl Huysman's 1891 novel Le Bath, and the 19th century dime novel Varney the Vampire. Quite a lineup. The other three essential anthologies in this category were published as duologies, so they actually represent 6 volumes, or 10 if you count their paperback editions. The first is the Blackwater duology, edited by Alberto Manguel. The first volume was published in 1984, and Blackwater 2 followed in 1990. These aren't strictly horror anthologies. The subtitles of both volumes identify their focus on tales of fantastic literature. However, many of the stories have a dark edge to them, straddling both the fantasy and horror genres. Another thing that sets these volumes apart from most other English-language horror anthologies is their strong international focus. Nearly half of the 136 stories in the two books are translated works or originated from countries outside the US or the British Commonwealth. Like the Wolf anthology, they provide a very eclectic mix of stories, with good representation of female authors and many stories not commonly anthologized. Most of the stories are from the 20th century, but a few 19th century tales are included as well. Noteworthy authors include Graham Greene, Hermann Hesse, Jorge Luis Borges, Karen Blixen, Silvina Ocampo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Amos Tutuola, Jean Cocteau, Sylvia Townsend Warner, and Margaret Atwood. The next essential anthology, duology with a broad historical scope, comes from editor David G. Hartwell, who published The Dark Descent, The Evolution of Horror in 1987, and Foundations of Fear, An Exploration of Horror in 1992. These are enormous volumes, each of which was later split into 3 smaller volumes when published as mass-market paperbacks, for a total of 6 books. The Dark Descent contains 56 short stories and novelettes published between 1835 and 1984, while Foundations of Fear focuses more on longer works. It has 30 short stories, novelettes, and novellas published between 1865 and 1985. Together, these two anthologies provide an excellent overview of the history of the horror genre. Some of the featured authors include Nathaniel Hawthorne, Robert Aikman, Joanna Russ, Flannery O'Connor, Manly Wade Wellman, Philip K. Dick, Tanith Lee, and Robert Bloch. In Foundations of Fear, you can find classic works such as Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, John W. Campbell's Who Goes There, Richard Matheson's Duel, Octavia Butler's Bloodchild, and George R. R. Martin's Sand Kings. And the final essential duology is more recent and is part of the Library of America series. It's American Fantastic Tales, Terror and the Uncanny, Volumes 1 and 2, edited by Peter Straub and published in 2009. In them, Straub takes a chronological journey through the history of American horror stories. The first volume contains 44 stories covering the period from Edgar Allan Poe to the pulp magazines of the 1930s, while the second volume contains 42 stories from the period 1940 to 2007. Straub does a nice job of avoiding overlap with other prominent anthologies. Some of the authors represented in the 2 volumes include Herman Melville, Bret Harte, Lafcadio Hearn, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Henry S. Whitehead, John Cheever, Jack Finney, Stephen Milhauser, Michael Chabon, Tim Powers, and Jeff Vandermeer. As I said earlier, this category has many excellent anthologies, but I didn't want to label all of them as essentials, mainly due to story overlap among them. Here are several honorable mentions. Mary Danby compiled and edited a series of 3 anthologies between 1979 and 1982, titled 65 Great Tales of the Supernatural, 65 Great Tales of Horror, and 65 Great Spine Chillers. Their stories span the period from 1819 to 1982. There's also 1981's The Arbor House Treasury of Horror and the Supernatural, edited by Bill Pronzini, Barry Malzberg, and Martin H. Greenberg. It was reprinted a few years later in 1985 under a new title, Great Tales of Horror and the Supernatural, and slightly abridged, with only 40 stories instead of the 41 in the original edition, spanning the period 1844 to 1980. Anthologist Marvin Kaye produced Masterpieces of Terror and the Unknown in 1993, containing 58 stories from 1858 to 1991. And weird fiction scholar S.T. Joshi edited American Supernatural Tales in 2007. It has 26 stories from 1824 to the year 2000, from authors such as Charles Beaumont, Shirley Jackson, T.E.D. Klein, Norman Partridge, and Caitlin Kiernan. For readers wanting to dive into the early history of the horror genre, I have 3 essential anthologies and 1 honorable mention. The first essential is 1972's Gothic Tales of Terror, classic horror stories from Great Britain, Europe, and the US, 1765 to 1840. In it, editor Peter Haining compiles what might be the most extensive single-volume collection of Gothic horror short fiction ever published. It was also issued as a 2-volume anthology in 1972 and 73 under slightly different titles, with the first volume focused on British authors and the second focused on European and American authors. British works represent half of the 60 stories in the anthology. There are also 12 German stories, 10 American, 4 French, and 4 from other parts of Europe. Authors include Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, Walter Scott, William Thackeray, Johann von Goethe, E.T.A. Hoffmann, and Friedrich Schiller. And 12 stories are by anonymous authors. There's also Joseph Margoli's 1946 anthology, Strange and Fantastic Stories, which collects 50 stories from the period 1706 to 1939. It pairs well with the 1944 Herbert Wise and Phyllis Fraser anthology I discussed earlier in the category of historically significant anthologies. It's a mix of terror, horror, and merely strange stories by authors such as Daniel Defoe, Honoré de Balzac, Ambrose Bierce, E.M. Forster, E.T.A. Hoffmann, Dorothy Sayers, Joseph Conrad, and Hugh Walpole. Unfortunately, it was never reprinted, so copies are somewhat scarce these days. And the third essential anthology of older horror stories is the Oxford Book of English Ghost Stories, edited by Michael Cox and R.A. Gilbert and published in 1986. It features 42 haunting stories dating from 1828 to 1967. However, the overwhelming majority are from the 1800s and early 1900s. It includes many of the best-known ghost story writers, along with some that aren't as well known today, such as Oliver Onions, Arthur Quiller Couch, Amelia B. Edwards, Mary Wilkins Freeman, and Mary Elizabeth Braddon. For my honorable mention, I've selected another anthology from Marvin Kaye. Masterpieces of Terror and the Supernatural, published in 1985, includes 53 stories spanning the period 1774 to 1985. Although it includes a few relatively modern works, its primary focus is on older ones, including several from Germany, France, and Russia, by an eclectic range of authors such as Walt Whitman, Damon Runyon, Tennessee Williams, Ivan Turgenev, Pierre Courtois, Bram Stoker, Jack London, Abraham Merritt, and Saki. It also includes Ray Russell's 1961 story Sardonicus, which Stephen King once described as perhaps the finest example of the modern Gothic ever written. Anthologies focused on modern horror stories, those written in the past 50 years or so, can present a challenge to readers because of how the genre has evolved and become more sensationalized in recent decades. The genre as a whole has grown increasingly graphic and shocking in its depiction of horrific situations and events. However, modern authors vary widely in the degree to which they've embraced that trend. This has effectively bifurcated the genre into 2 distinct strains and polarized many readers. One strain of modern horror remains aligned with the dry, spooky, and suspense-filled stories of the past, although somewhat more explicit than their older cousins. The other emergent strain is much, much wetter, and seems more interested in shocking readers with unpleasant shivers than in delighting them with pleasant ones. For many readers, one strain is enjoyable, while the other is not to their taste. Many modern horror anthologies struggle with that division of taste. In the past, dry, literary stories and wet, pulpy ones could coexist in an anthology without alienating readers. That's harder to do today because of the extreme efforts by some authors to amplify the gore, the taboo-busting, and the feelings of revulsion in their stories. As a result, horror anthologies published since the 1990s have tended to emphasize one strain or the other, depending on the editor's taste or marketing priorities. It's become difficult for readers to know what kind of stories they're going to get in a modern horror anthology. They can get caught by surprise when a volume edited by a reliably staid and traditional codger such as Martin H. Greenberg, turns out to be a shock fest. For my essentials in this category, I'm including examples of drier and wetter anthologies, and some that attempt to bridge the divide between them. I'll start with the dry side and Peter Straub's 2008 anthology, Poe's Children, The New Horror. Straub is pretty clear in his preference for literary-style terror fiction over pulpier horror. In his introduction to the volume, he positions its stories as a kind of antidote to the seamy and disreputable grotesqueness prevalent in a lot of recent horror fiction. The book contains 24 stories from the period 1982 to 2006, written by an assortment of authors he describes as new wave fabulists, including Elizabeth Hand, Kelly Link, Joe Hill, John Crowley, Thomas Tessier, Ellen Klages, and Stephen King. It's an excellent anthology that offers proof that traditional horror is still alive and kicking and hasn't joined the ranks of the undead. On the wetter side, there's 1990's Borderlands, the first in a series of anthologies edited by Thomas Monteleone. The marketing blurb for the volume plainly states that it's not concerned with traditional elements of horror fiction and is instead concerned with breaking the mold and pushing the genre and its finest writers to the edge. Monteleone wanted readers to be truly horrified by its contents. Its 25 stories were written between 1984 and 1990 by established authors such as Harlan Ellison and Daryl Schweitzer, and emerging ones such as Joe Lansdale, Bentley Little, Nina Kariki Hoffman, and Poppy Z. Bright. The other two essentials are best of the best collections from two of the most prominent horror anthologists of the past 40 years, Stephen Jones and Ellen Datlow. They're pretty representative of the path modern horror has taken. Jones's The Mammoth Book of Best New Horror, 2 decades of dark fiction, published in 2010, includes his pick for the best story of the year from the first 20 years of the annual Best New Horror anthologies he edited from 1989 to 2008. It's a blend of dry and wet stories, but the wet ones predominate. Notable authors include Michael Marshall Smith, Kim Newman, Lisa Tuttle, Neil Gaiman, and Caitlin Kiernan. In 2018, Ellen Datlow produced her own Best of the Best New Horror of the Year, 10 Years of Essential Short Horror. Her taste seems to run even wetter than Jones, and most of the 28 stories in the volume reflect that preference. They date from 2008 to 2017 and were penned by Laird Barron, Stephen Graham Jones, John Langan, Shannon McGuire, Lucy Taylor, and Brian Evenson, among others. My honorable mentions are likewise representative of the general direction horror fiction has taken in recent decades. The first is 1988's Prime Evil, New Stories by the Masters of Modern Horror, edited by Douglas E. Winter. Its 13 stories were commissioned for the anthology from authors including Stephen King, Clive Barker, Thomas Ligotti, M. John Harrison, David Morrell, Peter Straub, and Ramsey Campbell. Then there's a series of 3 horror story anthologies, confusingly labeled Volumes 5, 4, and 3, and published in that reverse order between 1989 and 1992. They're omnibuses collecting 9 of the annual anthologies from the 1980s, edited by Carl Edward Wagner, titled The Year's Best Horror Stories. Not only are the stories worth reading, but the cover art by Michael Whalen is among the best ever produced for horror anthologies. The selection of stories in the second volume, Volume 4, might be the best of the lot. I'll also note that Wagner's original annual anthologies are easier to find than these omnibuses, which were published only as limited editions by specialty press Underwood Miller. In 1998, Richard Chismar produced The Best of Cemetery Dance, compiling 57 stories originally published in the pages of Cemetery Dance magazine between 1987 and 1996. If you like splatterpunk and other similarly gruesome tales, this one is for you. It was later divided into 2 volumes for a reprint edition. Alternatively, if you have a hankering to sample award-winning stories, the Horror Hall of Fame, The Stoker Winners, is a good place to start. Edited by Joe Lansdale and published in 2012 by Cemetery Dance, it compiles 13 short stories and novelettes that won the Bram Stoker Award for Horror Fiction for the years 1987 to 1996. It includes works by Lansdale, Harlan Ellison, George R.R. Martin, Thomas Ligotti, Jack Ketchum, Robert Bloch, and Jack Cady, among others. And my final honorable mention in this category is another one from Peter Straub, who co-edited with Bradford Morrow Conjunctions number 39, The New Wave Fabulists, in 2002. Like Straub's anthology Poe's Children, Conjunctions number 39 focuses on somewhat drier literary horror stories. Its 18 tales from 2001 and 2002 include works by Nalo Hopkinson, Jonathan Lethem, China Mieville, Elizabeth Hand, and John Crowley, among others. There have been a great many themed horror anthologies published over the years. Too many for me to feel comfortable excluding most of them from this list of essentials. Some have broad themes such as ghost stories, monster tales, or science fiction horror, while others have narrower themes such as weird westerns, urban horror, and erotic horror. I've selected a few of both types. The first one has a Lovecraftian theme. Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, edited and published in 1969 by August Derleth and Arkham House, collects 19 iconic stories from members of the original Lovecraft Circle and later authors who were influenced by them, including Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Frank Belknap Long, Robert Bloch, Ramsey Campbell, and Brian Lumley. A second, revised edition was issued by Arkham House in 1990 that replaced a few of the 1960s-era stories in the original edition with 1970s stories by Stephen King, Joanna Russ, Carl Edward Wagner, Jose Philip Farmer, and Richard Lupoff. Continuing with the weird fiction theme, there's 1988's Weird Tales, 32 Unearthed Terrors, edited by Stefan R. Ziemianowicz, Robert Weinberg, and Martin H. Greenberg. It includes a story from each year the influential magazine was published between 1923 and 1954. Featured authors include Ray Bradbury, Fritz Leiber, Catherine L. Moore, Seabury Quinn, Edmund Hamilton, Theodore Sturgeon, and Richard Matheson. And for broad and deep coverage of topics such as ghosts, zombies, and vampires, it's tough to beat the comprehensiveness of Otto Penzler's anthologies, The Big Book of Ghosts, Zombies, 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 and The Vampire Archives, published between 2009 and 2012. Although Penzler's anthologies tend to focus on older works from the mid-20th century and earlier, they also contain quite a few stories from recent decades, as well as unexpected appearances by classic crime fiction writers such as H.R.F. Keating, Donald Westlake, and Frederick Brown. My honorable mentions for themed anthologies all come from just two editors. Robert Arthur's work as an anthologist for Alfred Hitchcock helped the horror genre reach mainstream readers in the 1950s and 60s. Between 1957 and his death in 1969, Arthur edited a series of 6 horror and suspense story anthologies under Alfred Hitchcock's name, with titles such as Stories They Wouldn't Let Me Do on TV, Stories My Mother Never Told Me, Stories Not for the Nervous, and Stories for Late at Night. Although not expressly crime-themed, they tended to include an above-average number of stories with crime, violence, or mystery elements. Authors represented include Roald Dahl, Ruth Chatterton, Evelyn Waugh, Edward D. Hoke, Shirley Jackson, and Avram Davidson. Paperback reprints of the anthologies are readily available on the used book market, although sometimes they're abridged with fewer stories. Robert Arthur was more than just an anthologist, though. He was an accomplished mystery writer who wrote stories for adults and for children. Among other things, he created the Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators mystery series and wrote several of the early books in it. It was one of my favorite series as a kid. Thus, it was a natural fit for him to compile horror and suspense anthologies for children in the 1960s, several under Hitchcock's name, with alliterative titles such as Ghostly Gallery, Haunted Houseful, Monster Museum, and Spellbinders in Suspense. I devoured these as a kid when I discovered them in my elementary school library, and they're excellent introductions for young middle-grade readers to spooky and suspenseful tales. Authors such as Algernon Blackwood, Lord Dunsany, Ray Bradbury, Henry Kuttner, Daphne du Maurier, Margaret St. Clair, Manly Wade Wellman, Raymond Chandler, Muriel Spark, Theodore Sturgeon, and William Hope Hodgson can be found in their pages. And the other editor with honorable mentions in this category is Marvin Kay. Kay was a terrific anthologist, and I've never encountered a disappointing one from him. Although I haven't designated any of his volumes as essentials, he has honorable mentions in 3 of the 5 anthology categories I'm covering in this video. If you run across any Kay anthologies, you should give them a close look. In the 1980s and 90s, Kay edited a series of horror and supernatural anthologies with distinctive cover art by Edward Gorey. I've already mentioned 2 of the broader scoped ones in my discussions of earlier categories. Others in the series had narrower themes, such as Devils and Demons, a treasury of fiendish tales, old and new, from 1987, and Witches and Warlocks, Tales of Black Magic, old and new, from 1990. Authors in them run the gamut from Somerset Maugham to Bertrand Russell, Morgan Llewellyn, Robert Sheckley, Park Godwin, John Kendrick Bangs, Nikolai Gogol, Ray Russell, and L. Frank Baum, among many others. And Kay also edited a 1988 anthology of 44 stories from the original Weird Tales magazine and its later reincarnation in the 1980s. Titled Weird Tales, the magazine that never dies, it features works by authors such as Hugh B. Cave, Anthony Boucher, William Tenn, Val Luton, Dorothy Quick, and Theodore Sturgeon, although not quite as essential as the Weird Tales anthology I discussed earlier that was published the same year. Kay's volume makes a great companion to it. I hope you found this list useful. For your convenience, I've included Amazon links to many of the books in the video description. And, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to see the full list of stories in each anthology, the Internet Speculative Fiction Database has them at isfdb.org. Thanks for watching.